The cell measured roughly 8 feet by 13. Nuremberg prison, late 1945, and seated across a small table from Hermann Göring was Gustave Mark Gilbert, a U.S. Army psychologist with daily access and a legal mandate to assess the mental fitness of the Reich's surviving architects. Göring had expected, upon surrendering to American forces, to negotiate. He found, instead, a cell and a trained observer. What followed across months of recorded sessions was not confession. It was not breakdown. It was something considerably more difficult to analyze. A man of exceptional intelligence deciding, with apparent deliberateness, exactly what he would and would not reveal, and why that distinction may matter more than anything he actually said. The cell measured roughly 13 feet by 6. That is not a large space in which to conduct the most consequential psychiatric interviews of the 20th century, yet it was sufficient, more than sufficient as it turned out, for what passed between Gustave Mark Gilbert and Hermann Göring across the months of the Nuremberg proceedings. Gilbert was a United States Army psychologist assigned to the prison with unusual latitude, daily access, no guards present during sessions, a notebook, and the institutional authority to ask whatever he judged relevant. Göring was the highest-ranking Nazi official to survive the war, a man who had spent 12 years at the center of the regime's power and who arrived at Nuremberg expecting, by most accounts, to negotiate. He found a cell instead. What he chose to do inside that cell, how freely he spoke, what he offered, and what he withheld with extraordinary deliberateness, is the problem this account is built around, not whether Göring was guilty. That question the tribunal would answer. The question here is what it means that he talked at all, and what a man of his intelligence and self-awareness chose to say when he believed he was shaping the record himself. Hermann Göring did not rise to power through ideology alone, and understanding his trajectory requires setting aside the simplified portrait that post-war memory tends to produce. He was born in January of 1893, the son of a colonial administrator, and by the end of the First World War, he had accumulated a record as one of the Luftstreitkräfte's most decorated fighter pilots, a legitimate military credential that he would spend the remainder of his life deploying as a form of personal authority. His entry into the National Socialist German Workers' Party in 1922 was not the conversion of a true believer, so much as the alignment of an ambitious opportunist with a movement that rewarded exactly the qualities he possessed: physical presence, rhetorical confidence, and a sophisticated understanding of how institutional power was actually distributed and held. The positions accumulated in sequence: President of the Reichstag from 1932, Minister-President of Prussia from 1933, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe from its formal establishment in 1935, Plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan from 1936, a role that placed him at the center of the regime's economic mobilization and gave him oversight of an industrial apparatus that would become directly implicated in the use of forced labor. Each appointment brought him closer to Hitler, not as a personal intimate in the way that others were, but as an institutional peer, the second man of the state in formal terms, the man whose signature appeared on documents of enormous consequence. Proximity to Hitler, in Göring's case, was not a matter of personal affection maintained against all evidence. It was structural. He was useful, and he was positioned to remain useful across the years when the regime's ambitions expanded faster than its capacity to execute them. The deterioration of that position followed the Luftwaffe's failures with a kind of institutional logic. After the Battle of Britain and the subsequent inability to deliver on Göring's own extravagant promises regarding air superiority and supply capacity during the siege of Stalingrad, his standing with Hitler declined in ways that were both practical and personal. By 1943, he had become, in the assessment of those close to Hitler, a peripheral figure, still powerful in formal terms, still holding his titles, but no longer consulted on the decisions that mattered. The final rupture came in April of 1945, when Göring, having moved south to Berchtesgaden as Soviet forces closed on Berlin, sent a telegram to Hitler asking to assume leadership of the Reich in accordance with the succession decree Hitler himself had signed in 1941. Hitler's response was to have Göring arrested on charges of treason. The man who had been, in title and protocol, the second figure of the German state, spent the final weeks of the war under SS guard in his own compound. His surrender to American forces in early May of 1945 carried, by multiple accounts, the quality of a man arriving for a meeting he had requested. He presented himself in full uniform, accompanied by luggage, expecting to be received at a level commensurate with his rank. What he encountered instead was the procedural machinery of military capture, the confiscation of the parakodine tablets he had been consuming in significant quantities for years, the medical detoxification that would occupy the early weeks of his imprisonment, and eventually the transfer to Nuremberg and the cell in the Palace of Justice prison wing where Gilbert would find him. Gilbert's access was singular in ways that the historical record has not always sufficiently emphasized. He was not conducting a clinical evaluation in the narrow forensic sense. He moved freely through the prison, spoke with multiple defendants across the proceedings, and maintained a detailed journal of his observations and the conversations he recorded. His qualifications were legitimate: a doctorate in psychology from Columbia University, service experience, and a working knowledge of German that allowed him to conduct sessions without an interpreter present. The sessions with Göring were frequent, sometimes daily during the most intensive phases of the trial, and Göring engaged with them willingly. He was not compelled to speak. He was not offered inducements in any documented form. He chose to talk, at length, on subjects ranging from military strategy to his own psychology to the nature of the regime he had served. That choice, deliberate, sustained, made by a man who understood leverage and narrative better than almost anyone else in the prison, is the fact from which every subsequent question in this account proceeds. Göring had spent his career understanding what information was worth and to whom. He did not stop understanding that in the cell at Nuremberg. He talked. The question is what that talking actually revealed. Gilbert did not enter those sessions as a passive recorder, and Göring did not mistake him for one. The dynamic between the two men, a trained American psychologist with a doctorate from Columbia University and unrestricted daily access, seated across from the most institutionally powerful Nazi to survive the war, was never the simple clinical encounter that a surface reading of Gilbert's notes might suggest. Göring was alert from the first session onward. He assessed Gilbert with the same attentiveness he had once applied to political rivals and military subordinates, and he calibrated his responses accordingly. Forthcoming on subjects where frankness cost him nothing, elaborately general on subjects where specificity might. What Gilbert recorded across those months was not a confession. It was a performance of candor, and the distinction matters enormously. The sessions began in earnest in the autumn of 1945 as the trial itself moved through its opening phases. Gilbert moved through the prison with unusual latitude, speaking with multiple defendants across the proceedings, but his sessions with Göring were the most sustained and, by his own account, the most analytically demanding. Göring was, Gilbert noted across multiple entries, in noticeably better physical condition than he had been at capture. The forced withdrawal from parakodine had reduced both his weight and his pharmaceutical dependency, and the man who sat across from Gilbert was considerably sharper than the bloated figure who had presented himself to American forces in May. That recovery was not incidental. A Göring capable of focused, sustained engagement was a different interlocutor than a diminished one, and the sessions reflect that capacity throughout. On the subject of the final solution, Göring's account to Gilbert followed a consistent and carefully maintained line. He had known, he acknowledged, that Jews were being removed from German public and economic life. This was, he indicated, policy he had supported and in some cases administered. But the operational details of the extermination program, the specific machinery of the camps, the systematic killing, these, he maintained across the recorded sessions, had been conducted outside his knowledge and his authority. He positioned himself as a figure concerned with the war economy and the Luftwaffe, not with the administration of the SS apparatus that Himmler controlled. The framing was sophisticated precisely because it was partially grounded in institutional reality. The SS was Himmler's domain, and jurisdictional lines within the regime were genuine and complex. What that framing required Göring to ignore was equally substantial. The documentary record, as the trial transcript establishes, includes materials bearing his signature that connected him directly to the broader administrative framework within which the extermination program operated. The authorization he signed in July of 1941, directing Reinhard Heydrich to prepare a total solution to the Jewish question in German-occupied Europe, is among the most consequential documents introduced at Nuremberg. Göring's account to Gilbert treated this document with the kind of elaborate contextual qualification that acknowledges existence while minimizing implication. He had signed what he was presented with, he suggested, within an administrative context that he did not then understand in its full operational meaning. Historians who have examined this claim in relation to the broader evidentiary record have generally found it unsustainable, though the precise degree of his foreknowledge remains a matter of ongoing scholarly disagreement. His characterization of Hitler across the sessions was similarly calibrated, and in some respects more revealing. Göring described Hitler with a combination of genuine intellectual admiration and retrospective critical distance that positioned Göring himself as the more rational actor, the man who had understood the strategic limits of the war, who had counseled restraint at moments when Hitler had overruled him, who had watched the German military position deteriorate through decisions he had opposed. This portrait served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was, in part, a defense argument. A Göring who had been overruled is a different legal subject than a Göring who had concurred. It was also, in part, something that cannot be entirely dismissed as fabrication. The record of the regime's internal disagreements is sufficiently documented that some of Göring's claimed dissents align with known events. Rudolf Semler, who served in the propaganda ministry and whose diary covers overlapping periods, recorded instances of friction between Göring and Hitler's inner circle on strategic questions that Göring's account to Gilbert partially corroborates. On the German people and the responsibility they bore for the war and its consequences, Göring offered assessments that were, by the standards of the other defendants, genuinely complex. He did not, in his sessions with Gilbert, reach for simple exculpation of the population. He acknowledged that the German public had supported the regime's early achievements without asking sufficient questions about their cost, and that this support had made the later atrocities possible in ways that implicated a wider circle than the leadership alone. This was not the language of a man performing complete innocence. It was the language of a man who understood that a more textured account of responsibility, one that distributed culpability across institutions and populations rather than concentrating it entirely on named individuals, served his own position by diluting it. The first significant gap in Göring's account surfaces precisely here, in the space between what he acknowledged about collective knowledge and what he maintained about his own individual knowledge. He was willing to say that Germany had known, in some general sense, that terrible things were being done. He was unwilling to specify, in any session Gilbert recorded, what he personally had known, when he had known it, and what he had done or failed to do with that knowledge. The distinction he drew between systemic awareness and personal ignorance was one that the documentary record makes increasingly difficult to sustain, and it is a distinction he returned to with a consistency that suggests deliberate construction rather than honest recollection. That gap, introduced here and visible across the recorded sessions, is not incidental to understanding what the Nuremberg interviews can actually yield. The gap between what Göring claimed he did not know and what the documentary record demonstrates he had access to is not, on close examination, a gap that resolves itself through charitable reading. It is a pattern. Across the recorded sessions with Gilbert, Göring consistently acknowledged what the trial transcript had already established in evidence: the signed authorizations, the administrative frameworks, the broad contours of policy, while systematically declining to elaborate on anything that had not yet been formally documented and placed before him. This is not the behavior of a man reconstructing memory as honestly as he can manage. It is the behavior of a man who has read the evidentiary landscape with considerable care and decided, with equal care, where the boundaries of his admissions should sit. The distinction between those two things is the analytical center of what the sessions actually reveal. Calibrated deflection, as a method, differs from crude denial in one important respect: it is much harder to refute. A man who simply denies knowing about atrocities can be confronted with documentary evidence that contradicts the denial. A man who acknowledges the framework while maintaining careful ignorance of its operational details occupies a more defensible position, because the question of what any individual knew at any precise moment within a complex bureaucratic structure is genuinely difficult to answer with certainty from the outside. Göring understood this. His account to Gilbert on the subject of the extermination program's operational dimensions was not structured as a denial. It was structured as a claimed boundary of knowledge, a line between what his administrative role required him to know and what fell, in his framing, outside it. That framing was sophisticated enough to have occupied historians for decades after Nuremberg, which is itself a measure of how carefully it was constructed. What Göring almost never addressed across the recorded sessions, and what Gilbert noted without pressing, the record suggests he chose not to pursue the subject through sustained questioning, was the specific operational history of the Luftwaffe under Göring's command in relation to civilian populations. The bombing of Guernica in April of 1937, in which the Condor Legion under German command destroyed a Basque market town, killing an estimated 150 to 1,600 civilians depending on the source consulted, had established the Luftwaffe's capacity and willingness to conduct operations against civilian targets well before the war began. The bombing campaigns over Warsaw in September of 1939 and over Rotterdam in May of 1940 extended that pattern under Göring's direct command authority. In the sessions with Gilbert, these operations appeared only in the most general strategic contexts, never examined in terms of the orders that authorized them or the knowledge of their likely human consequences that those orders implied. That silence was not incidental. The comparison with Albert Speer's sessions with Gilbert is instructive, not because Speer was more honest. The evidence does not support that reading, but because the two men employed fundamentally different strategies of self-construction that illuminate each other by contrast. Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, built his account around the claim of technical competence deployed in service of a state whose political and moral character he claimed not to have fully understood. He presented himself as an administrator, absorbed by the logistics of production, distanced from the ideological apparatus by the very efficiency of his focus on the practical. Göring's strategy ran in a different direction. He claimed proximity to power as a credential for his own account, while using that same proximity to argue that he had been overruled at the moments that mattered most. Both strategies were sophisticated. Both were ultimately self-serving in ways that the respective evidentiary records make difficult to sustain. And both, historians who have examined the notes have observed, reveal more in their architecture of omission than in their explicit content. On the question of individual responsibility, a subject Göring returned to across multiple sessions, always with what Gilbert described as philosophical engagement rather than defensive anxiety. His Account was rhetorically accomplished in ways that deserve attention precisely because they do not reduce to simple evasion. He acknowledged that leadership carried accountability for outcomes, and he did not attempt to argue that ignorance of atrocity dissolved that accountability entirely. What he did argue, with considerable rhetorical skill, was that the accountability was distributed across an institutional structure of such complexity that assigning it to named individuals through a legal framework designed for different kinds of crimes was itself a form of distortion. This argument has a version that is historically serious. Scholars have genuinely wrestled with the question of how legal frameworks designed around individual criminal intent map onto the collective machinery of state-organized mass murder. But in Göring's mouth, in that cell, the argument served a purpose that cannot be entirely separated from the fact that he was making it about himself. The interpretive question that the sessions finally press toward, and cannot cleanly answer, is whether any of this constitutes genuine reckoning, or whether it constitutes something more troubling, a final, extended performance for an audience Göring knew would outlast him. A man of his intelligence, sitting in a cell at Nuremberg, understood that Gilbert's notes would become a historical document. He had spent his career understanding how information was preserved and what it was subsequently used to construct. It would be remarkable if that understanding had not shaped what he chose to say. But the alternative reading, that a man genuinely attempting to examine his own history would produce exactly the kind of calibrated, strategically bounded account that Göring produced, is not obviously more credible. The sessions do not resolve into either portrait cleanly. What they contain is revealing. What they conspicuously omit may be the more consequential record, and it is a record that the sessions themselves, by design or by instinct, were not structured to produce. The tribunal delivered its verdict on the 1st of October, 1946. Göring was found guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, waging aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death by hanging. His response, as Gilbert recorded it in the hours that followed, was controlled in a way that the preceding months had made predictable. Not the collapse of a man confronting extinction, but the composed reaction of someone who had already decided how this moment would be managed. He objected not to the guilty verdict, but to the method of execution. Hanging, he maintained, was a soldier's death denied and a deliberate humiliation. He requested a firing squad. The tribunal refused. What Göring did with that refusal is the last and most revealing act of a life organized around the management of self-presentation. On the night of the 15th of October, 1946, hours before the scheduled executions were to begin, Göring crushed a cyanide capsule between his teeth in his cell at Nuremberg prison and died before the hangman could reach him. The capsule's origin has never been conclusively established. It remains one of the minor unresolved questions that cluster around the major ones, though inquiries conducted in the months afterward produced several plausible theories and no definitive answer. What is clear is that Göring had planned the act with the same deliberateness he had brought to everything else across the preceding year. He left behind a written statement explaining his reasoning. He had not, he wrote, feared death, but he had refused to allow the manner of his death to be determined by others. That framing, asserting authorship over the one remaining variable, is entirely consistent with the man Gilbert had sat across from in that small cell across months of sessions. It is not defiance of justice in the simple sense. It is the final exercise of the only control that remained available. Gilbert published his account of the sessions in 1947 under the title Nuremberg Diary. The book became, and has remained, one of the primary documentary sources for understanding the psychological texture of the Nuremberg defendants, their rationalizations, their self-assessments, their interactions with one another across the strange suspended period of the trial. It is a valuable document. It is not a transparent one. Gilbert was not a passive recorder, and Nuremberg diary reflects the interpretive framework he brought to the sessions as much as it reflects the sessions themselves. He had judgments about his subjects, judgments formed through training, through observation, and through the moral weight of the evidence he was witnessing presented in court daily. And those judgments shaped what he chose to record, how he summarized exchanges, and which moments he returned to with analytical emphasis. A document produced by a trained psychologist attending to what he found significant is not the same as an unmediated transcript. Historians who have worked with the original notes alongside the published text have observed that the two do not always align in emphasis, and that Gilbert's selection and framing were consequential. This is not a criticism that diminishes the record's value. It is a description of what the record actually is. The sessions between Gilbert and Göring produced a document that is simultaneously irreplaceable and incomplete. Irreplaceable because no comparable access to a figure of Göring's position and intelligence existed anywhere else in the post-war period. Incomplete because the conditions of its production guaranteed that it would reflect the negotiations of its own creation rather than transcend them. Access is not the same as transparency. Gilbert had more access to Göring than any other researcher or investigator across that period, and the record that Access produced is still, more than 7 decades later, the closest available approximation of Göring's own account of himself. That approximation is useful. It is not the same as the truth beneath it. What the encounter between Gilbert and Göring ultimately illuminates is something more general and more difficult than the question of what one man knew or concealed. A perpetrator of the first order, intelligent, self-aware, practiced in the management of information and impression across a career spent at the center of state power, does not become transparent under clinical examination. He becomes a more sophisticated version of what he already was. The clinical frame, the institutional context of the prison and the trial, the presence of a trained psychologist with evident analytical intentions, none of these conditions stripped Göring of the capacity he had spent decades developing, the capacity to decide what to reveal and what to protect, and to present that decision as something other than a decision. What Gilbert recorded was real. It was also constructed, and the construction was Göring's. A man who understood power well enough to accumulate and hold it across 12 years at the center of the most destructive regime in modern European history, and who retained that understanding clearly enough to deploy it in a prison cell awaiting execution, is not the kind of subject that psychological examination was designed to fully penetrate. The method was genuine. The access was genuine. The resulting record is genuine. And yet the question of what Göring actually comprehended about what he had participated in, what he carried in full consciousness, what he had arranged not to know, what he had known and then performed not knowing across the sessions, that question remains where it was when Gilbert first sat down across from him. Not because the evidence is insufficient to form judgments. It is sufficient for that. But because the distance between what a man says about himself and what he is remains, in cases of this kind, a distance that no degree of proximity fully closes. The record stands. The gap stands with it.